So what were those misconceptions you had about Stoicism that made you to, write it off for so long?
Well, it was the standard misconception that Stoics, the capital S Stoics, uppercase S Stoics, were also lowercase s stoical, and that is that their goal was to suppress all emotions and simply bottle themselves up so they became oblivious to the kinds of disasters that the world would present. And what I discovered is that they weren't anti-emotion. They can better be described as anti-negative emotion. So they drew the conclusion from their observation of humanity that we human beings experience all sorts of negative emotions, and it's our own fault that we do. So negative emotions like anger, like grief, like envy, and you can fill out that list considerably. Those are things that disrupt our days and disrupt our lives. And yet, it dawned on the Stoics that to a considerable extent, if we're experiencing those emotions, it's self-inflicted. It's because of certain values we've adopted. It's because of certain strategies for living that we've chosen to use. And so we have it in our power to change our goal in living and to change the strategies we use. And we can thereby make those negative emotions, they never disappear from your life, but you can diminish their impact on you. At the same time, the Stoics had no problem at all with experiencing positive emotions. For instance, one of my favorite positive emotions is the feeling of delight. And as a Stoic, you're delighted by any number of things that normal people will take utterly for granted. And then you have perhaps the ultimate positive emotion, and that is a feeling of joy, this disembodied feeling of just gratitude that you get to be part of this universe populated by these people. So it's a wonderful thing to have, wonderful thing to experience. And the Stoics said there's nothing wrong with that. So for me, that worked wonderfully well.
How can thinking about everything that could go wrong, how can that actually lead to more happiness?
Okay, well, if the advice were to dwell on negative outcomes, then it would be terrible advice, because you're going to become quickly a horribly depressed individual, and you're just going to go around moping about how sad everything is. But that isn't their advice. Their advice is that you should allow yourself to have flickering thoughts. So a flickering thought is the key phrase about how things could be worse. And it's amazing, number one, whatever life you are living, things could be worse. Things could be very dramatically worse than they are. I mean, if you're telling me about how bad your life is, hey, guess what? You've got the ability to speak. There are people who don't. There are these interesting cases of people who not only lose the ability to speak, but lose the ability to communicate in any way. They have what's called locked-in syndrome, and they might be able to blink one eye. Well, if you can tell me how miserable you are, you're not in that situation. And so guess what? Things could be worse. And people have that thought, and then they realize, it's true. Things could be worse.
So yeah, you don't dwell on it, because that'll just turn you into a neurotic worrywart. What do you do? I think this would work well for folks who, okay, they're living a comfortable life, and you're like, oh, okay, my car is totaled. It could be worse. I can take care of this. But what if you're destitute? Is this still effective? You're like, hey, at least you're still alive. It's like, well, I'm alive, but things are terrible. Do you think that the negative visualization works even if your life is actually really, really, it's like rock bottom?
We have the stories of ancient hardships. So there was Musonius Rufus, who was exiled to the Greek island of Hieros. And it was a desolate rock. Now, there were some fishermen who lived there, but otherwise it was nothing. So from the Romans' point of view, well, we aren't going to kill him. We're going to let him live, but we're going to put him on this rock. And then the interesting thing was that he was able to find things to be thankful about, even under those circumstances. You know what? If you have that ability in you, you are pretty much bulletproof to an incredible extent. So life can really abuse you in a number of ways, which is unfortunate. But the key thing is you don't become a broken human being as the result of it.
Okay, so another Stoic practice you talk about in the book is the Stoic trichotomy of control. This is actually, you modified an original Stoic idea. What was the original Stoic idea and how did you modify it?
The original idea might be called the dichotomy of control. So it's a dichotomy. It's either one or the other. So when it comes to the issues in your life, the Stoics said there are those that you can control and those that you can't control. And you're foolish to spend your time thinking and worrying about things you can't control because, after all, you have no control over them. And I kind of tampered with that a little bit. I think I clarified it because if you think about it carefully, there's actually three different possibilities. There's things you have absolute control over. And that might include your beliefs. It might include your desires, although maybe that's arguable. There are things you have absolutely no control over, such as whether the sun's going to rise tomorrow. You obviously shouldn't concern yourself with those things. And the Stoics didn't make this clear. It seems like there's this middle class of things where you have some but not absolute control. For instance, how people treat you and how they relate to you. If you treat everybody terribly, they're going to be mean to you probably. And if you're nice to everybody, there's a good chance, but it's not a sure thing that they're going to be nice back to you. So, but again, the Stoic advice would be you should really concern yourself with things you have complete control over. One of them would be your character. You should work very hard to develop your character since you have complete control over that. You should care very much about it. You should not allow yourself to think for even a microsecond about things you have no control over, because you don't have control over them. And then there's an intermediate amount of thought to those things that you're going to have some but not complete control over. And then there's all sorts of qualifications that come in, although you may have zero control over whether an event happens or doesn't happen. You might have considerable control over how the event affects you. So you can take preventative measures, you can take measures to make things not as bad as the otherwise might be, and the Stoics were absolutely fine with that. But if you look at the people around you and maybe even think about yourself, and you realize there's a whole bunch of just time wasted thinking, worrying, dreading things that you don't have any control over. And, life is precious, and to spend it on that is a pity. And then also not to spend the investment of time on things you do have control over, like your personality. That's also tragic because that can have a huge influence on your life, and you do have complete control. And so if you're ignoring it, shame on you.
So where do emotions play in this trichotomy? Because I think there's a perception out there that Stoics believe like you have complete control over your emotions. Did they think that, or was it something different?
No, Stoics realize that emotions are a real issue for human beings. And so when it came to emotions, first thing they did is they distinguished between negative emotions and positive emotions. So negative emotions include anger. They include envy. Envy is a really terrible negative emotion, underrated in the damage that it does. Positive emotions are feelings of joy, are feelings of delight. And the Stoics had nothing against the positive emotions. In fact, they thought we should live our life in a way that would increase the number of positive emotions we experienced. But they also thought we should go out of our way to reduce the number of negative emotions we experience. They also realized that it was impossible for us ever to get the number down to zero, but we could reduce the number dramatically. For instance, in their discussion of grief, they said that if someone you know and love dies suddenly, that grief is the natural emotion. And so you will feel it, and in some sense you should feel it, but you should keep it within its proper confines. And he describes people who, a decade after the death of a spouse, were still mourning the death of a spouse. Well, that's just too much. So They acknowledged the existence of emotions. They welcomed some emotions, and they thought we needed to work on techniques for limiting the damage that the negative emotions could do to us. And they have some ideas on how we could do that.
Yeah, I guess one of them was, I guess Seneca was like, imagine your son's already dead was one of them.
You should not imagine that he's dead, but you should have a flickering thought that a realization and acknowledgement of the fact that he will die. And first, when people hear that, actually, that was Epictetus who kind of most famously said that. But when people first hear that, they think, well, what a terrible, terrible thing to think. But the Stoics would say just the opposite. I will just allow myself to have the flickering thought that this might be the last time I see that friend. And it really is remarkable, because then the next time I see them, it's this delightful event, because it didn't have to be that way. So it's curious, they were some of the preeminent psychologists of their time, and they have these insights that to our modern ears sound just crazy. But if you like the idea that by thinking about people dying, we can actually improve our relationships with them. But I encourage your listeners to give it a try. Again, don't dwell on the deaths of other people. That's a recipe for a miserable existence. But this whole notion of a fleeting thought that you allow yourself to have about bad things that can happen, it's wonderfully easy to do. And it's wonderfully effective. At least that's what I found in my own life.
So with this part of the trichotomy where there's things you have control over but not complete control over, what's the Stoic approach to those things so that you put some effort into it, but you don't vex yourself too much? How should you go about those items?
Yeah, the example I give of that in my book, Guide to the Good Life, is I talk about tennis match. So it's in that middle ground. There's some things you can control, some things you can't control. So how do you prepare for a tennis match? Well, you do the best you can to prepare for it. And that might mean getting coaching. That might mean practice. That might mean, how much you sleep the night before. That'll mean a whole variety of things. So that's the part you can control. So you exercise the control you can. But here's the thing. Suppose that despite that you lose the match. Then the Stoics' approach would be, well, so what? I did the best I could. And if that wasn't good enough, that means the other person is simply a better player than I am, and I can live with that. But that whole notion of in life, pick your challenges and then do the best you can on those challenges, and then win, lose, or draw. That's it. Don't allow yourself to get upset over it, because that is the best you can do. And to ask yourself or to blame yourself for not doing better than the best you could do, again, that would be another recipe for a miserable life. Now, there are people who do that, and they do seem to have miserable lives, and it's avoidable. And isn't that tragic? It teaches you other things. One of them it teaches you is self-discipline. It's a chance to practice a kind of courage, a very valuable thing. It's a chance to practice the strategy of when things look hopeless, just keep trying. And, there are a lot of people that when things look not even hopeless, but just they don't look like sure things, they stop trying. And that's a bad thing, because there's so much of life where, really just a bit more effort on your part can make a huge difference in the outcome.
So let's talk about fate. Fate's a big part of the Stoic philosophy. It's because fate is a part of nature and you have to just accept fate. But being a fatalist seems very passive. And you're just like, well, you can't do anything about it because that's what fate had in store for you. So how did the Stoics approach fate, where they accepted it but still try to be active in their life?
Stoics, again, would do a kind of division here. They would say you should be fatalistic with regard to things that have happened in the past, and you should be fatalistic with regard to whatever is happening to you at this very instant, because you can't change those things. So you can either accept them the way they are, or you can make yourself miserable. But they weren't fatalistic about the future. So you can have an impact on what happens in the future. So we're kind of back to the dichotomy of control. So it makes it sensible for you to invest time, energy, intellectual processes into trying to shape the future. But then when that future arrives, you can't change it. It's there. So what do? You make the best of it, and then you go on to whatever is going to happen the next day. You look forward to tomorrow. But there are people who, it's a strange thing, but they're perpetually hoping for a better future, and they're perpetually disturbed, disgusted, dismayed by whatever life they happen to be experiencing at that very moment. Downside is that means they get to spend their entire life dismayed, disturbed, disgusted. So, you know what? Embrace the life you find yourself living while simultaneously trying to improve that life in various sorts of measures. I mean, when you're a Stoic and you look around at how people are living, and the same is probably true of other philosophies of life. If you're a Buddhist and you look around at how people are living, and you're struck by how needlessly miserable so many people are. It's the choices they've made, and it's the kind of techniques they use for dealing with life that seem like they should work, but there's just massive amounts of evidence that they simply don't work. And that's too bad. That's just too bad.
So this is interesting too. You highlight in the book is, most of our vexations, I feel like, in life are caused by other human beings, family members, just an annoying coworker. But I thought it was interesting about the Stoics, instead of becoming hermits and avoiding these people in order to maintain Stoic serenity, the Stoics felt duty bound to be out there and interact with other people. Why did the Stoics feel like they had a duty to interact with these people that causes most of our problems in life? What was going on there?
Okay, the Stoics thought we have a social duty, to be with and to try to help and relate to our fellow human beings. But that didn't go as far as saying we had to go out of our way to find the most miserable company that we could. And for one thing, it's going to be a very depressing time for us. For another, there's a good chance that we won't be able to help those people. There are people whose idea of a relationship is simply to stand there and complain about everything. And what that person needs is major change in kind of their approach to life. So what do? You try to be helpful to other people. And, I never go around preaching Stoicism because I found it's a great way to lose people's attention. But you know what? You can throw these little bits of Stoic advice, and you don't even necessarily attribute them to Stoics, and you can thereby make a difference in people's lives. So somebody's worried about something. And, just to throw out, a suggestion like, well, is there anything that you can do to change this? Well, no. Okay, then don't worry. And, it's interesting how that can have a profound impact, how somebody can sort of realize, what, he's got a point there. Well, one other thing about adults is they have to be ready for whatever advice comes along. Another thing is you can lead by example in a way. If people can sense that in your own life you're thriving, then they get curious and they wonder, well, what's he doing that I'm not doing? And if you're miserable, people learn from that too. Same kind of thing, the opposite lesson. What's he doing that I should avoid doing? Yeah, but it's a strangely paradoxical philosophy and goes against what most people think is common sense. But then again, lots of people are pretty miserable.
Right.
So maybe we shouldn't pay attention to what most people go by.